All right, welcome everybody to episode 27 of SFF Addicts, where we will be traveling across the mists of time discussing gods and mythologies. And I find it fascinating how cultures all over the world, past and present, have complex and powerful mythologies and folklore and narratives around creation and people and places and objects. So it's really incredible how these storytelling traditions are finding a new home for a modern audience, especially in fantasy stories, which is why I'm very happy to have these four authors here with me to unfurl this topic. And first up is my friend Dyrk Ashton, making his second appearance on the show, although third technically, because we did the 1-year anniversary special. Dyrk is the author. That was the first appearance, and then the second was the 1-year anniversary. And Dyrk is the author of the Paternus Trilogy, as well as a co-host on the Wizards, Warriors, and Words podcast. And he also loves mythologies from all across the world, so I'm really excited to get your perspectives on this topic. And welcome back, Dyrk. How are you?
Good. And I'm happy to give my perspectives on this subject.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be on with all these wonderful folks. I've never done a panel with any of you guys, so.
Yeah, man. And my next three guests are all making first appearances on SFF Addicts, and that includes Chelsea Abdullah, the author of The Stardust Thief, which is her debut and released this past May. She also grew up in Kuwait, listening to stories about mysterious desert creatures and wily, only sometimes likable heroes. And I can't wait to hear more about that. So very happy to have you here, Chelsea.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Great to be here with all of you.
Yeah. And also with us is Gabriela Houston, author of the Slavic-inspired books The Second Bell and The Wind Child. She was raised in a book-loving household on a nourishing diet of mythologies, classics, and graphic novels, so she surely has a lot of amazing insights to contribute. So welcome to the show, Gabriela. How are you?
I'm great. Excited to be here with you all guys.
Yeah, me too. And last but not least, Zamil Akhtar. He's the author of Gunmetal Gods and its sequel, Conqueror's Blood, as well as Song of a Dead Star and the lit RPG book Lightblade. At 14, he moved from the dry, dune-spotted Arabian Peninsula to the hilly Arctic wasteland of western Massachusetts. For now, Zamil dreams up dark and fantastical journeys for readers to immerse themselves in, and I'm glad that you've taken their time to be with us today. How are you, buddy?
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, pleasure. And just to get things started, I want to know, I'm going to ask each of you, what does mythology as a concept, and this will be a little bit loose because we'll fluctuate between terms like mythology and folklore. We spoke a little bit about this before recording, but what does mythology mean to you personally? And Gabriela, I'll start with you.
So, mythologies are basically stories of religions. Some of them, we usually use the word mythologies when we refer to religions that people don't practice anymore. But people often also use them to describe, Christian mythologies or sort of Islamic mythologies. So it's basically stories of religions, and the difference between that and folklore to me is quite blurry. But folklore is basically mostly oral traditions to do with sometimes with religion, but also the supernatural, the kind of people believe in, and that has to do with the everyday.
Yeah, and for you personally, how has it played into your life, whether it's, direct cultural or familial influence or something that you sort of sought out just through curiosity?
So in Poland, when I was growing up, the Polish folklore and Polish mythologies, they were not very well known. They're still not, even though they're becoming more, they're sort of gaining in popularity. But so they were mostly considered, to be stories for small children. And then as I sort of grew up a bit, I started getting interested in other mythologies because there were just more compelling materials on them, really. So I became very interested in Greek mythologies and, Norse mythologies and Celtic mythologies. But then I kind of grew, got back into the Slavic mythologies as an adult. And I'm grateful for that gap, actually, because it allowed me to get a bit more of an insight and sort of in comparative sense. There's a lot of sort of small things in Poland that are deeply rooted in folklore, even if people don't quite sort of instantly click. But it's to do with the old beliefs. because it's all that's left of those old beliefs in the everyday, as they were kind of, those old customs were sort of gradually erased by the church or incorporated into the church. So we had, there's a holiday in a Polish Catholic church that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world, for example, of there's a holiday of, just to give an example, of the Virgin Mary of the Herbs.
Really?
It's a holiday. So it was originally a Mokosh holiday to do with the goddess who is, you know, a healer and a mother and all that. And
Moist Mother Earth.
herbs. And so basically, because it was a day when people would gather herbs and, you know, do like a blessing with them. And now people on that holiday bring those herbs to church to be blessed, because it's now the Virgin Mary holiday. So that's how
you bring like a bundle of herbs to go get blessed.
Yeah, which sounds random, right? I mean, it sounds quite random in the context of sort of Christian faith, but all of that was basically taken from the old beliefs and brought into, and so people are not even aware that they're following the old customs because it's so closely sort of intertwined now. So there's quite a lot of stuff like that in a kind of everyday.
That's awesome. Fascinating.
That's awesome.
Cool. Thank you, Gabriela. And Chelsea, what about you? How does mythology play into your life as a concept, but also something maybe part of your cultural and familial tradition?
Yeah. So I think, for me, my interest in mythology and, specifically my interest in mythology and, folk tales, folklore from the Swana region sort of came about after I left. I think a lot of people say, your heart always grows. What is the expression? Distance makes the heart grow fonder.
Yeah.
So I had this feeling when I left Kuwait, because I was born and raised there. And I left to go to university in the States. And it was around that time that I started, just really missing all of Kuwait in general, but specifically the stories that I had grown up with. So it was around that time, especially, I think, that I started thinking about mythology and stories, and thinking about versions of stories that I had heard before in a sort of different way. I remember reading The Juniper Tree by, the Grimm brothers, and sort of in my head thinking about this version of the story that I had heard around the Swana region, which I think is called The Green Bird. And, sort of thinking to myself, well, this is a story that exists in that region too. And, I started thinking about the intersections of, storytelling in the past, but also, how mythologies sort of collided, how, people would believe in one god in one region, but then have a different name for that character or that being in a different location. So I was thinking a lot about that, when I left, and I was thinking a lot about how, what those stories were, what the versions of those stories were, in Kuwait, where I had, been raised. I did, when I was in my master's program, I did a master's program at Duquesne University. That was sort of my area of study, was looking at the intersections between stories and seeing how like they had blended into various cultures, looking at the hundreds of versions of Cinderella and seeing, how they were really, these are themes and tropes and, that have appeared forever for the longest time. So yeah, I think for me, the Stardust Thief, which is my debut, was kind of where, I don't want to say where my interest started, because it's always been there. I've always listened to these stories. But that was sort of where I, started to put it all down on the page, all that love and affection for those stories and, the appreciation for the storytelling culture. That was when I, when it started to accumulate, and I could put it down in one location.
Awesome. And yeah, we'll get into that in a little bit, just about like the way that your fascination with mythology and stories and that kind of stuff started to become an integral aspect of your writing. But I'll toss it to Zamir first and get your take on, what mythology means to you personally and your history with it.
Yeah, very, very similar to what Chelsea described, actually, because I also used to live in, I used to live in Saudi Arabia, and I also went to the United States. And I had a sort of a similar reaction in that when I moved, I became more interested in the stories that were told, where I had grown up, and in how that worldview is very different from the worldview of the new country that I was living in. In particular, Saudi Arabia is a very like religious place in a sense, and people's worldview is very much colored by religion and by the stories told in that religion. And some of these things you could call mythology, some of these things you could call folklore, because they're more like traditional tales instead of things that are steeped in, a religious tradition or that are steeped in some kind of deeper storytelling. But what fascinated me was that when you compare, for example, Christianity and Islam, a lot of the stories are exactly the same, and these stories have their origins, in the Middle East, in you could say like the Sumerian times, the Babylonian times. You find the story of the flood, for example, that is very similar to the story of Noah, told in the Bible and told in the Quran. So to me, mythology was just it was tied to religion in that sense, and it was also just an interesting way for me to understand how these societies described their origins, how they saw the cosmic horizon, basically how they saw their place in it, and how these things sort of grew from being mythologies for one particular society to being like a mythology or a religion that spread across the world in different incarnations. And beyond that, I'm also interested in my origins are from Pakistan, so I'm also interested in a lot of the tales that are told there that predate Islam. So you could say that relate more to Hinduism or Zoroastrianism, and that also I find very interesting because what some people see as stories, other people will see as sort of having a cosmic or divine importance. Just across the border in India, like a lot of the things we would consider just to be stories are believed by those people to be divine. So it's just interesting to me how mythology, folklore, and religion intersect, and it's just played a big role in my life as I've moved across cultures and been in different places and seen how people seen what people believe and how these things impact them day to day.
Oh, you guys already have me so excited. I'm just like loving all of this so much. Dyrk, I'll toss it to you because I know you have more of like a perspective of like seeking out a lot of these mythologies and that kind of stuff. So give me your take as well.
Well, I mean, I've always been, like I said, I've always been fascinated with mythology since I was very young, but that all grew out of being fascinated with fantastical stories since I was really young. Dr. Seuss is about these talking weird creatures, and some have magical powers, right? And Charlotte's Web, a talking pig and a talking spider, and just all these kinds of Stuart Little, and these kinds of things. Just I loved them and read all the kids' fantasy books, Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, and all those things. But even before then, I started reading. I mean, of course, I knew something about the Old Testament, and I knew that was part of Christian religion and things like that, and the stories of Moses parting the Red Sea, and the fiery wheel in the sky, and that stuff was all kind of exciting. But of course, I got into Greek and Norse early, being an American, because we didn't bring. My family's been here for since before before the Revolutionary War. And, you know, we didn't really bring anything from England. But then I very quickly got into Celtic and, of course, Arthurian, which is more legend. But then it just went everywhere. And I just got super excited by, you know, Mesoamerican and South American, and then Hindu and South Asian, East Asian, Pacific, Islander, and, you know, a lot of these things like the Vedic and the Puranic traditions, and a lot of the South American stuff, that stuff is batshit crazy what they do and what they can do, right? And they make the Hebrew Old Testament seem lame compared to what goes on. And they all contradict each other all over the place. And it's a lot of fun. And then the more I read, and I just, you know, sometimes I'd have a few years in college or whatever when I wouldn't be reading that stuff, and then I would go back to it, and I was always fascinated with it. And then I'd find something new. I got into the African, which is like saying world, right? Because there are so many different stories, some that are similar, some that are not. But if anybody talks about like African voodoo, well, it's not African. It doesn't go across all Africa, and some would not even know what that was. They have their entire own things, and they started basically, they all have an origin story, right? Where do people come from? Where do their kind of people come from? And then these stories just expand and expand. And it wasn't until later that I put a connection that these are actually their religious stories, just like the Old Testament is for Christian religion or Muslim, even to a certain extent, religious stories. I started seeing similarities, the same things you were saying, talking about these similarities, and it makes you wonder if the same story carried and was changed a little bit, a lot more than we would have ever imagined, or if it's just something in us, you know, early people that kind of told the same stories. So those ideas of some mythemes were really kind of what inspired me to do the Paternus Trilogy.
Yeah, it's so interesting because, you know, I like how you frame it as like, you know, humans have this inherent need to sort of
all of them
explain things and kind of make sense of the world, and these stories. Go ahead.
We've yet to come up to find any indigenous peoples or groups of peoples that don't have stories,
like a storytelling
ancient,
tradition,
fantastical stories. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's really cool, you know, because there's sort of this this transitive effect across time that humans have the inherent desire to tell stories. And Chelsea, you brought this up earlier, sort of like what inspired you to get started and put words down for the Stardust Thief. It's so cool because now all of you living here today have the same desire to tell stories, but using that tradition and also using the tradition of fantasy and these genres that we've become accustomed to in the modern day. And Chelsea, I'll let you continue on with what you were saying earlier about, you know, why you decided that these traditions that you were sort of ingratiating yourself into, how they would become an integral aspect of what would eventually become the Stardust Thief.
Yeah. So, you know, like I said, I was very much involved in, like, you know, thinking about these stories and thinking about the connections and thinking about the nature of storytelling. When I started the Stardust Thief, I started it sort of very generally as a love letter to my culture, you know, to my Arab heritage, and, you know, also to those stories that I had grown up with, especially the oral stories. And, you know, most people will be familiar with, I think, the 1001 Nights, which are universal in the sense that people have told them in various different ways, across, you know, different cultures. But, you know, I wanted to tell a story, or I wanted to write a story that was inspired by the versions that I heard growing up. I think, you know, and this was something that kind of came to me in retrospect as I was writing the story. But I was thinking about, you know, Arab coded characters in fantasy, and thinking about, you know, how those stories and these characters had traditionally been depicted in fantasy.
Right.
And as I was writing the Stardust Thief, I was thinking, you know, we have all these beautiful stories, and we have, you know, this beautiful culture. And I want to write a love letter to that, but I also want to, you know, I want to embed it in the story in a way that feels natural to this world. So, you know, I didn't set out to write the Stardust Thief as a retelling of the 1001 Nights or any of that. It was just sort of like I said, a love letter to oral storytelling in general. And then oral storytelling, you know, as found in that region, you know, that I experienced. And I thought a lot about oral storytelling in particular. You know, I was thinking in when I was in Kuwait, you know, before I left, when I was still back in high school, I was looking for books on the shelf, you know, that had the Arab coded characters in fantasy. But I was also looking for, you know, folklore books and like tales from around the region, and looking for these stories. And I realized that a lot of the stories that I had grown up with, I heard them orally, but I hadn't actually seen them, you know, depicted in any kind of text. And I'm sure that those texts exist out there. You know, there are wonderful writers who are writing those, you know, those versions of those stories, or their own personal versions of those stories into novels now, which I think is, you know, amazing to see sort of this branching out in fantasy now. But back then, you know, I didn't see a lot of it on the shelf. And so I was thinking, well, you know, we have this really rich oral storytelling tradition. We have all of these incredible folk tales, some of which are familiar to other people, and some of which, you know, are maybe a little more obscure. But I would like to bring them to light some way. And again, I think that was something that I kind of wrote into the story naturally. And it was only once I had got into the end that I realized, you know, oh, so many pieces of myself and, you know, these stories that I heard made it into the story just naturally, because I set out to write this story that was, you know, I keep using the term love letter, but I feel like that's the most apt term for it. You know, because this story is very, I mean, it's a, you know, dark things happen in this story, but also it's a very hopeful story, and it's supposed to be something, or I hope it's something that people read, and they come out with an appreciation for this specific storytelling culture, but also just oral storytelling in general, because, you know, as I said earlier, there's been so many intersections over time. And, you know, thinking about oral storytelling now, and thinking about, you know, like people think about mythology, and originally a lot of those stories were told orally, and, you know, a lot of those folk tales were shared orally. And then, you know, eventually they were put to the page, and, you know, different writers wrote different versions. And then, so the stories kind of evolved over time. But, you know, I had this sort of like, I was thinking about all of this when I jumped into the Stardust Thief, and was thinking I would like people to have, or I would like them to come away from the story having not just an appreciation for oral storytelling, but an awareness that we're still telling those stories today. You know, we're retelling them, you know, we're all writing them into novels. But every single day, you know, we tell each other stories, whether it's, you know, telling someone the story of what happened that day, or, you know, a story of our family history. Like, we continue to share these stories. And I think, you know, sometimes people don't think about that. They say, I'm not a reader, I'm not ingesting these stories anymore. But, you know, I think in some way we're all kind of born and raised on these stories.
I have a question.
Man,
for
Chelsea, you're all about like foreshadowing today. Sorry, Gabriela. It's like, I have a question later on about like the power of storytelling, but Gabriela, go ahead. And then if you want to continue afterwards.
I just wanted to ask Chelsea, like, follow up on something that she said. So because you mentioned a couple of times that the stories that, you know, you had on the shelf were, you know, had perhaps like you used the frame like Arab coated characters. So were there any particular aspects of Kuwaiti culture or Kuwaiti folklore that you felt are underrepresented or misrepresented, or that you felt like you wanted to set something straight when it comes to the retelling of sort of folkloric kind of aspects of Arab culture that you wanted to sort of show to the world?
I think so. Thinking about, the depictions that I saw, I was thinking more in terms of cultural stereotypes. I think, a lot of people framing Arab characters as villains, or making them savage, and just not really having any nuance to their characters. And I think a lot of that, I like to think a lot of that happens kind of unconsciously. These are stereotypes that are, that people experience through different outlets, through maybe the news that they take in. Like, they have these perceptions of what the people in that region are like. And you see some of that bleed into the stories, I think. And, some of it, I think, in some ways had become a trope. Like people always making, thieves out in the desert are, there are a lot of Arab coded thieves in the desert. And I write thieves in my story, but everyone in this story is Arab coded, so.
I think if everyone in the West will have known some version of Alibaba story and, Sinbad and, and obviously, like you mentioned, the 1001 Night, but yeah.
And I think too, like, some depictions are better than others. There were definitely some cartoons, which, I no longer remember what they were called, but there were cartoons I watched that were based off the 1001 Nights. And I would watch some of these cartoons and be a little appalled by the way these characters were depicted.
All the versions of Aladdin.
Yeah.
And I think, there's this concept of sort of like exoticizing this region of the world, rather than, making it human. And so that's sort of something that I wanted to do with the Stardust Thief. I just wanted to write real characters, people who felt real, who weren't stereotypes, who weren't relegated to these tropes that had become sort of flat and harmful over time.
And I think that perception definitely changed in like the post 9/11 landscape as well, where there's this dehumanizing aspect and perspective that's placed upon the Arab world, especially from like a North American or Western viewpoint. And so it's like all of the, preconceptions that existed before that, and then mixed in with this very negative viewpoint, and all of that just kind of mixes together to create this very unfortunate and sort of toxic misrepresentation of that part of the world and its traditions and its people, and the fact that it's like, no, everyone's human. There's just this sort of like blanket bullshit veil that you place over an entire culture. And it's, Dyrk was saying, like, you go into Africa and there's so much diversity there that it's impossible to say like, voodoo as a thing of like Africa as its entirety, or the Caribbean as its entirety. It's like, no, enough with that.
And I think, a lot of people, people who do watch the news and who watch like, very specific channels, who, those are the sorts of outlets that they, that's where they get their information from. Journalism is, for as much as people say, we've got, journalists try to be unbiased, journalists try to tell the stories, they try to tell the facts. Even journalism is a form of storytelling, and there's a bias there. So when you have, exactly. And so when you have all these stories coming out about the Arab world that depict it in a very specific kind of way, or, which focus on very specific kinds of people, and that's all you watch, those are the only kinds of like, that's the only news that you take in, then unfortunately that's going to paint your opinion of, another region.
Yeah, 100%. And Gabriela, I'll toss it back to you to sort of get your take on, you look so scared.
No, I'm not blushing, by the way. I just realized I look completely red.
Nice,
and I think it's because, I have literally the sun setting in there.
It's very pretty. Don't worry about it. For you, you mentioned that you got back into Slavic folklore and mythological tradition later on in your life. How did that then translate in you wanting to write, The Second Bell and The Wind Child?
I think it's I didn't necessarily originally set out to sort of just draw on Slavic mythology. I just sort of, I was reading different versions of the Strzyga story. Strzyga is basically, in Slavic folklore, is pretty straightforward, like demon, right? It's like a kind of, it's usually someone who's been cursed in some way, and it's almost like a Slavic answer to vampires, you know. So, but there's different versions of the story. There's sort of the more Christian element, and there's some which are kind of pre-Christian. And you have a version of the story which I really like, where the main character kind of breaks the curse by getting in the tomb of a girl who was cursed, born like 15 years or 16 years before, and she appeared to be dead. And basically, so she was buried in this tomb, but at night she turns into this monster who basically kills and eats people. And he broke a curse by basically, he climbed into her tomb at night when she was sort of roaming, and he took her place, and he felt sort of through incredibly deep empathy, through like absorbing her pain and loneliness and that fear that she must be living in, so in this isolation and this hunger she doesn't understand, and this fear and, you know, people trying to hurt her and all of that. So he absorbed it in, and by doing that, he broke the curse. So that is not necessarily the most common version of the story from what I've seen, but that act of kind of empathizing with the enemy is something that's quite struck me, and that's why I sort of when I was writing The Second Bell, just to give a quick explanation of what the book's about, it's like, you know, in this far-off community, sometimes there's a child that's born as Strzyga. So we know it's a Strzyga, but because it has two hearts, it has two heartbeats, and the community considers such a child to be the enemy and to be a monster, an abomination, and that must be abandoned on the edge of the forest. And sometimes the child's mother chooses to leave in voluntary banishment with the infant and join the community of Strzygas in the mountains. So I was thinking about, you know, how, you know, such a parent, even if they felt compelled to leave with a child, it doesn't mean that they didn't believe their child was evil. It just meant that they saw their obligation towards a child as an imperative. So, so I was thinking about that in context of the myths, and then it kind of snowballed, because I realized, you know, people in the West don't really know anything about Eastern European cultures and traditions. They, you know, they tend to think that we're all Russian, you know, and it's maybe there's like a bit more of a growth of awareness this year, you know, with a war in you know, in Ukraine. But I think there's people don't know very much about this mythology. It's just not very popular. There's a good reason behind it, because there's not many texts that are written about sort of Slavic folklore, so it's not popularized, basically. You know,
all the stories are very short. They're not very long.
Yes, because it was rooted in oral storytelling. So it wasn't, and a lot of the stories, we're kind of digging them up, and they're being, especially when it comes to not folklore, but mythology. So folklore is slightly easier to access. You can kind of get a grasp of it from local customs, local, you know, like songs and poems, and, you know, fairy tales, things like that. Mythology is more complicated because there were no monks writing it down in Poland. You know, when it was forcibly Christianized in sort of about 1,000 years ago, and it was for political reasons, it was considered to be necessary at the time, and it was a very quick and brutal process.
Yep.
Right.
And so it was imperative to try and erase as much of the old beliefs as possible at the time. it's just, the way Poland was sitting, it's like, I understand, but what it means is that we don't have, there's no written, we don't have our metamorphosis, right? So a lot of it is sort of now pieced together. So the awareness, but basically the bottom line is the awareness of sort of Slavic folklore, Slavic traditions, different sort of countries in a sort of Eastern European, cultural bloc, as it were. So it's just non-existent. And I thought it's a shame because there's just so much that is, they're just beautiful stories and really interesting characters and interesting creatures. So when I was writing The Wind Child, which is my children's story, now that is really, it's not just inspired, it's just really rooted in the mythology. So it's a children's book, and you have sort of, obviously I change things as the mood strikes me. I'm not saying I'm not doing it. I'm not an academic. I'm
for your convenience,
fantasy lover, right. But I thought it's just so nice to introduce like characters, but like beyond Baba Yaga, I would say. So it's just things that are so unfamiliar that it's sometimes nice to sort of read and watch something that is completely outside of your comfort zone, because like if you don't expose yourself to the things like outside of your comfort zone, then you will sort of cease to grow, and maybe you'll discover your new favorite thing.
And for me personally, it's like I love Eastern European folklore and all the stories and stuff like that, but it wasn't until I was introduced to the Witcher series that I was really, my eyes were open to that kind of stuff. And especially the Witcher 3 video game was the one that, like, I'd never heard of a Striga until I played the Witcher 3. And it's like, that just clicked something in my head where I was like, okay, this is a Polish studio. And so they're drawing on a lot of their own tradition here. But that was the impetus for me to seek stuff outside of it and sort of figure out, like, where does this come from? Because these are like morality tales and tales of just humanity that I've never experienced before, because it's so dark and twisted, but very honest and raw. And I appreciate that, because it's like, growing up in Canada, I was kind of like Dyrk, like my relationship with mythology was very much rooted in whatever was available for my curiosity to seek out, as opposed to something that like my parents passed on to me or what have you. So
we had Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and the Bumble.
Yeah. Well, I had the story of the spirit of a drowned man who tried to drown himself a girlfriend so he could have someone to marry. So.
Wow.
We love cautionary tales.
Oh,
it was a sad story. It was a sad story. He didn't succeed.
Oh,
but that's life. Sometimes you don't succeed.
It's
sorry, buddy, but
there's certainly a level of brutality and ruthlessness and something that I like unflinching honesty to Slavic folklore and mythologies that I do like and I do appreciate. It's not things are not glossed over, for sure.
Yeah. I experienced that when I lived in Germany. It's like the cold, hard truth is always preferred over any other thing.
Different culture.
Yeah. I know, but it's still sort of like, I know I wouldn't lump Germany and Poland together directly, but it's like, I feel like
Germanic and Slavic are very,
there is a certain like blunt honesty that comes with.
For sure. It's a different brand of blunt honesty. It's like, you're yet to become a connoisseur of different levels of blunt.
And I'm so sorry to lump Poland with Germany. Poor Poland.
At the time, my Egyptian friend was saying that she was saying like Poles and Arabs are on the level of like brutal honesty and directness that a lot of like Anglo-speaking people don't really vibe with. So we have to kind of tone it down.
It's because we're passive aggressive, Gabriela. We thrive on passive aggression.
No, Canadians are just
Canadians
polite.
thrive.
Are just polite.
No.
Just
Surface
very polite.
level polite, sir. We talk shit in our minds. And Zamil, I'll toss it to you in terms of, why you thought, I want to start incorporating these gods, these mythologies, these storytelling traditions into your work.
Yeah, so Gunmetal Gods in particular has a mythology that is very much cosmic horror. So my incorporation of a lot of the mythologies that I mentioned earlier is not done in the most positive light, because the core basis by which I base the mythology on is, what if the gods are all evil? So that's kind of the basis of the mythology in the book, is that, okay, this society worships this god, this other society worships this other god, but they're all evil. And sort of where I drew this inspiration from is that, okay, if you if you are a let's say you're a Muslim, and you're living at the time of the Crusades, and you see a Crusader army come to your city, and Gunmetal Gods is actually based on the Crusades. What are your feelings going to be toward that civilization and their gods and their beliefs? In your mind, you're gonna probably think a lot of that stuff is rooted in some kind of evil basis, right? So, and this is how a lot of societies, in pre-modern times, thought of other societies. A very common one, as a Pakistani, I know is that Muslim Pakistanis thought of Hindus and their gods as being being jinns, basically. So jinns are a belief that Muslims have. And so we would think that, oh, their gods are just jinns, and the jinns are tricking them into making them worship them. So this is something which we were taught to think about, these other people. So, and a lot, I moved to the United States 2 months before 9/11. So I experienced a lot of this sort of tug of war religious animosity, where I was the only Muslim kid in my school. So, it was like this kind of colored a lot of my youth. So when I was sitting down to write Gunmetal Gods, it is a very dark book, and it is sort of based on this conception that one society will have another, of the other society being the other society's god or object of worship actually being some kind of devil or evil entity that is tricking them into worshiping. So I kind of created the mythology based on that, and it is a cosmic horror book. So, I drew a lot of inspiration from Lovecraft as well, who himself created a mythology. Lovecraftian mythology is very interesting because, obviously it's the product of one person's mind, but that person was so, in a sense, deranged that he came up with stuff that, to this day, a lot of authors based their whole stories on. Lovecraft is in the public domain, so you can literally take his gods and use them in your own story, which is not what I did, but I have very close analogs. So I kind of combined this with sort of the idea of religious warfare set in a Crusades kind of context, where two sides that are kind of analogs of Muslims and Christians, and the Muslim side, sort of like how Chelsea described, she wanted to write very human characters that were Arab coded. So I sort of did the same thing, more in a pan Middle Eastern context, like you have Persian and Turkish and Arab coded characters who are all, totally human, and, they believe what they believe. It's a grimdark book. So these characters often do horrible things, but that goes with the genre. But for me, the expression of mythology in that book, it is sort of to ask, maybe some even uncomfortable questions. You know, like Gabriela described. Gabriela told a story that is very frightening, right? So, I mean, if you're a little kid reading the Bible or the Quran, there are stories in there that are totally frightening. So how do you understand these things as adults? I mean, even as an adult, thinking about some of these stories, they're very scary. And you know, you ask yourself, like, is this necessarily a merciful God doing this thing in the story, or could this be an evil God? So that's sort of how Gunmetal Gods came into being. It sort of, you know, takes a lot of those things, like biblically accurate angels, and you know, all these sort of uncomfortable things that are within these mythologies or within these religions, and sort of combines them with cosmic horror, with a lot of ideas from Lovecraft. And yeah, I mean, it's pretty crazy, but that.
It
It's
is
sort
really
of like
good.
what you mentioned. It's kind of sounds a bit like a kind of Gnostic, like philosophical
absolutely.
approach, isn't it? Like, yeah. So it's
because if you're living, if you're like a medieval peasant and your life is hell, you were trying to grow crops for the last 6 months, but now there's a famine and your hard work has gone to naught. You're starving. What are you going to think about God? If you're like a true believer and you're holding tight to the coals, you're going to think, oh yeah, you know, God is testing me. God is, you know, I just have to have faith. I have to get through it. But there were people at the time who had a very different view, who actually did think, oh, God is actually evil. Whoever created this world is evil. And, you know, there's a good God somewhere, but he's not the one in charge of this world. So yeah, Gnostic philosophy was a big influence in that. And it's something I find very interesting.
And I love that you approached it with this kind of duality of cultures, but also duality of religion and mythology and these things, how they conflict, because the Crusades is essentially, like, it boils down to conflict on so many different fronts, not just physical warfare. You know, it's like ideology and religion and all these concepts of, like, you know, are you a true believer? Are you, you know, someone who's, what's the word? Like an infidel and that kind of thing. It's just like, are you someone who deserves to be in this world with my God? But then it's like you said, like, on the other hand, there might be a peasant who's like, I don't give a shit about anything that else is going on. I want to eat. And then someone comes in and, like, destroys your farm, burns your house down and everything like that. And you think, what just world is this? Like, what just God is there? You know, and then you look at that other culture and the people that are destroying your world, and you think, what kind of things do they believe in? I think it's cool that you really challenge and question that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Dyrk, what about you? Sorry, Zamil, go.
No, that's what Gunmetal Gods is all about.
Yeah, I love it. And Dyrk, what about you in terms of how you took your broad global love of mythologies and brought them into the craziness that is Paternus?
Well, first I want to say I still have my copy of Gunmetal Gods back there on those shelves, and I have to get to that.
Read
especially now. I didn't know there was the Cthulhu cosmic horror element.
It's on the cover.
And the Gnostic. Well, yeah, but a lot of people use that imagery, and it doesn't really show it as a core or a theme in the book.
True. Yeah.
But and I wanted to mention, Gabriela, I was so excited when you brought up Mokosh, because nobody ever brings up Mokosh. I mean, you just don't see that character or hear about that character. I came across her, and it wasn't in Polish. It was another part, because she's talked about in a little bit differently in different areas in the old Slavic world. And I was so fascinated with just the little bits that I could find that one of my main characters is Mokosh in Paternus. And I ran across a little prayer that you could say for your crops to grow, where you face the west, the north, the east, and the south, and say a little thing at each side, and about calming the winds and bringing the rain, and keeping enemies away and things like that. And I actually put
Very
that
cool.
in the book, and it's actually before a big battle at the end. It's actually Mirden Wilt, who is the inspiration for Merlin, who goes and does that, walks around her and does that little invocation.
Well,
So
that's so
yeah,
nice to hear.
it
It's
was,
like
it was really, really fun. That's why I was grinning when you were talking about Mokosh, because
Mhm.
such a cool
there's
character.
such strong link as well in terms of Slavic mythology and like Hindu mythology as well. It's really interesting.
Oh
It's
yeah.
all like Indo-European sort of language, and
Mm.
so it's like a lot of it has evolved. And
Mhm.
when
And
you
a
look
lot of
at
it
the character of
moved out of
Mokosh,
Zoroastrian and then was influenced by stuff that came out of other
Mesopotamia and all that. But like
and
when you
Mesopotamia, absolutely, yeah.
but when
And I
you look
forgot
at
to mention.
Mokosh and when you look at Morana, right? So the
Mhm.
only thing we have in folklore now from Morana is basically drowning the figure of Morana at the first sign of spring, right? But she was
Mhm.
actually like a goddess that's quite close to Kali
Mhm.
in terms of like, the goddess of death and rebirth,
Yeah.
of
Mm.
winter and spring,
Mhm.
and then you have Mokosh, who is like the like a Parvati almost.
Mhm. Mhm.
So you have those links as well. It's really
Yep.
interesting, but you're kind of bringing it out.
Yeah. Yeah. It was. Yeah.
Do you
It was really
localize
fun.
your mythological influences?
Do I localize?
So as in like folklore and mythologies kind of represent the values of each society they're from, right?
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
do you keep that? Do you sort of have
To a certain extent, yeah. I have so like what I used from Mokosh was she's a goddess of the earth, of the weather, of the crops, and is kind of a guardian, helpful goddess. And so I give her certain powers and give all these characters, I give them certain traits that come out of wherever that's from. Now, these characters are so old and they've been here since long before human beings. What they've done over the years, as they've traveled, over the centuries, the millennia, as they've traveled and become known by different names, the story takes place in present day today. So today, many of them live among people. So they've taken on a human persona. They can appear as people, though they don't normally. And they take on, like Mokosh is an older Russian woman, full figured, who owns a store and babysits my main character. She owns a Russian market, right? Now, the reason I used Russian as opposed to um, another Slavic area or country or region was that my sister-in-law is Russian, and I know how she speaks, and she knows a lot of this stuff. So that was something I could draw from, and that's really the only reason I would do a lot of things. So she speaks with a pretty heavy accent and uses a lot of Russian words and things like that. But it's because she chooses to, because she has no nation, honestly. She has no human culture, but she identifies, since that was kind of the last place she lived, and really kind of reigned in a certain way. She's carried that with her. And I have a big chicken god who is a bird god from Asian mythology, and old, like grimoire stories, and yet he's taken on a Scottish persona. So he speaks with a Scottish accent and teaches boxing in New York, and so they want to fit in, but by being foreign, if they live in the U.S., that excuses a lot of their oddities, right? So they still fit in, but it excuses a lot of their oddities because they're ancient beings. and don't particularly act like human beings most of the time. So yeah, I did. I drew a lot of that out, and that was a lot of fun. And it was also, I wanted to be respectful of all these cultures because I have characters from all over the place. And there were so many more I wanted to use that I just couldn't.
Yeah,
But
and Dyrk, on that note, it's like this notion of being respectful, I think, is very important when, you know, when it comes to narrative traditions. It's come up so many times during this entire conversation that things get changed up all the time,
mhm.
whether it's on like a person to person level or whether it's like region by region. And I think it's you know, Chelsea, you alluded to it earlier. You're clicked in here. You know, I think that is an inherent part of the power of storytelling, and that it can be personalized into your own individual tradition and the way that you carry that on to the next generation. But, you know, Chelsea, I'll get your take on this. How do you approach, you know, your respective mythologies and folklore and that kind of thing from a place of A, respect, but also B, you know, from the standpoint of a writer who's, you know, elaborating on their craft and their narrative abilities?
Yeah. So I think for me, it all comes down to just, I guess, honesty. Like, you know, when I tell people, you know, these are the versions of the 1001 Nights that I grew up with. It's, you know, very possible that you grew up with different versions, you know, that you are familiar with these stories in a different way. So usually when I talk about my writing this story, it, you know, it came from a very personal place for me. And I'm very cognizant of, you know, the way these stories have evolved even within, you know, that region. And the way how, like, you know, they change across the countries. You know, what I hear in Kuwait might be very different than a story that you would hear in, you know, Saudi Arabia. But so I always my sort of framework, and, you know, this was my framework for going into the story, is that, you know, this was a very personal story for me. So I'm just very honest about the fact that, you know, this is limited to my perspective, and the way I experienced these stories growing up, I think.
Yeah, I like that. And you know, why do you feel that mythology and these stories still resonate with people so strongly today, especially from our perspective as people who love fantasy and things like that?
I think, and we've kind of, you know, we've touched at this multiple times, I think, but, you know, stories are human, and we tell stories in order to make sense of the way the world is, and the way it can potentially be. You know, I think about sci-fi a lot, and I'm not a sci-fi writer, but what people can do with sci-fi is incredible. You know, balancing this sort of, you know, here's this knowledge of what we have of human nature today, and here is the way it could potentially be in the future. So I think storytelling in that way is a way for us to process human nature, and also just to explore it as well. And one of the things that I love about fantasy, you know, I think fantasy often gets a, you know, a bad rep from people who don't read it, who say like, oh, what am I going to get from fantasy? You know, this is a fantastical story. You know, I don't, you know, what is it about this that's, you know, it's not literary. It's not, it's not going to educate me. But the thing about fantasy is that it allows you to view things about human nature from a distance, I think. You know, all stories are inherently human in some way. So if you have something in fantasy, it doesn't matter that it's in a different world. You know, you're still writing characters who are human. You're still writing characters who are reacting to things and to stories and their culture and their environment in human ways. So, you know, every time I talk about fantasy, I always say, you know, it's escapism. Sometimes it can be escapism, but if you look deeper, you know, you see a lot of these echoes of human nature and cultures and all of these things that we have in our own reality. The incredible thing about fantasy is that it's just been refashioned and reshaped, you know, into a different world, into different cultures, which, you know, is one of my favorite things about it.
Yeah, me too, 100%. It's like this mirror that is held up to humanity to reflect what is there, but also give it, it's like the mirror in Snow White, where it's like showing your deepest desires, but it's like this is escapism on one hand, but at the same time you're learning about human nature, you're learning about empathy and emotions and characters and relationships and all these different things, just through the lens of something that some people would chide for being, childish or fantastical in a negative connotation. I think some people just don't really click in their head that it's like there's so much nuance and depth to the layers that you can present to readers in fantasy stories, but also absorb as a reader. And Gabriela, what about you? Like, what's your take on sort of this power that narrative and storytelling has, but at the same time, for someone who's giving Slavic folklore and mythology a more of like a modern, how would I put this? Like a modern reintroduction in a sort of way to a lot of people who may not be completely aware of it. What kind of emotional resonance does that give you as a writer?
Well, first of all, like several questions in there. So I'm just gonna back to it. So just sort of tying in with what Chelsea was saying, it made me. It reminded me of a panel I did a few months back with Empathy Lab. It's Empathy Lab is a UK charity, but it's doing some fascinating work. So they're working with neurologists and basically brain scientists of all descriptions, psychologists, who show that there's a direct and measurable impact that reading fiction has on our ability to empathize. And that you can actually, we all are born with a certain level of empathy, that is the ability to, sort of imagine other people's feelings. Like that's how it's. So it's not about like being sympathizing, but the ability to put yourself in the mental state of someone else. And they do interesting things like they scan the brain of a person. So if you have two people and one of the people is given a sort of electroshock, the other person who's witnessing it, the same areas in their brain light up as in sort of like pain response, as the person
empathetic pain response.
Who is getting the electroshock. So that's a kind of how we measure empathy. And apparently in the same way, reading fiction and other people's lives through fiction, you do experience those same things that the character is going through on a different level, naturally. But you do sort of experience that, and that fiction has the ability to train empathy in people. So that is something that I find quite interesting.
So fascinating.
And so again, and with what Zamil was saying about basically othering whole ethnic groups, or having sort of, I mean, dehumanizing, I mean, in certain cases, that's, obviously that's certainly the case, but it's not just dehumanizing. I think it's like, even when it's like kind of one step back, when it's like, this group of people, this nation is just not like me. And then like, I kind of, and in some ways, yes, obviously culturally we differ. Our, values in different societies are completely different, which people tend to underappreciate, I think, in certain places. Like I find, especially when people are of a certain descent, like, so I've seen it a lot of from quite a few people who are like, based in the States, but are not of a certain culture, but their like grandparents are from, Poland, from Japan, from Kenya, or whatever, and they would put their sensibilities onto that other culture that they don't inhabit, and through that get things wrong. So I think while it's very important to sort of acknowledge that there are differences, but it doesn't mean that as humans we're different, if it makes sense. So I think it's so those, I think I wouldn't want people to erase that, and I wouldn't, while I want people to be inspired and write stuff about Slavic folklore. I'm always very happy when people are inspired by it. I want there to be an acknowledgement that this is like, there's certain cultural elements here that we have to respect, but also that it's not that they're completely different people. They're, we have like really nice Polish people, we have really shit Polish people, we have,
just like anywhere else in the world.
Just like everywhere.
Exactly. So, I think when you other people, there's always, or you put like a certain group as a sort of completely separate. You either fetishize them, as in like, you mustn't criticize this group of people, you mustn't say anything about this group of people, or you go the opposite direction and dehumanize them, as, kind of post 9/11 we've seen. And I think fiction has this power to sort of bring it back, like what Chelsea was saying as well,
a good
about
middle
like
ground.
just making people human. And, but their reactions are not always nice or how we'd like people to behave, but they're human. So as long as we're believable, as those, like, your characters you create are really believable and like kind of realistic in the way they behave, that brings those cultures sort of closer together, and it allows people to access those different aspects of the cultures. And that's something that's very important to me.
Yeah, definitely. And Dyrk, you mentioned, paying homage to all these different mythologies around the world. How did you approach it from this angle of being respectful while also, giving readers the opportunity to become fascinated, as Gabriela's mentioning and as Chelsea's mentioning, like just understand the tradition that's there, while at the same time acknowledging that it's like, I am pulling from other places around the world, but I'm going to give you people who feel human and feel real, even though it's this God that has existed on the earthly plane for however many thousands or tens of thousands of years.
Mostly just by humanizing them. Some of them are even legendary among their own, because they're older, they're more powerful. And I try to humanize them all, even the bad characters, who some of which are really bad. Many of them have little gray area. They are one thing that I did, the way I put together this kind of unified field theory, is they're all related. The first generation are all brothers and sisters, basically, born from one being, so there's this familial thing, this family thing, that even the ones that hate each other and have killed off a whole lot of the other side or whatever, they're still family. So it's basically the world's oldest and largest most dysfunctional family. So there's always that kind of thing, right, going on. So, they call each other sister and brother, big sister, little sister, big brother, little brother, or just brother and sister in different terms and different words. But they all have that, and they all have kind of an odd respect for the other one, right? And some of them, the oldest are hundreds of millions of years old, and the youngest ones that are still around are, well, there's one that's very young, but 20, 30,000 years. That's a big difference, but they could still be just brother and sister. So that was another way that I wanted to that I used, that I didn't think of it in those terms, but it helped to humanize them. Or not, humanize is a really weird term to use for these
we're self-obsessed, aren't we?
Deities, but basically to make them more real. And the amount of suffering that every single one of them has gone through, good ones and bad ones, is just, you see so many that you love born and die. And a lot of them just haven't made it. Most of them are gone. There aren't very many left of either side. So they've gone through a lot in their lifetimes, no matter who they are or what culture what culture they've aligned with as they've come along. So that's basically kind of how I did it. And it's harder because I'm not drawing from anything that I can say is my own. So if I make one of my people a bad person, I can do that, right? But being a English white American guy, it's not that I really felt that I had to be more careful, but I wanted to be. But I also, it's not just all nice. I think I've succeeded in insulting just about everyone equally all the way along.
Fair. I mean,
what?
As long as it's fair, it's nothing more irritating than being like left out of it, just like general insults,
right.
What do you think my people are like such like shrinking violets? They can't take it.
You're right. Yeah. No, it's
exactly.
No,
Gabriela,
it's
shrinking violets is
it's very irreverent, but it's very irreverent across the board.
Yeah. Yeah, and Zamil, since you're taking this approach of like using the Crusades as an influence, what was your approach from blending and finding this balance between a respect for the tradition and the mythologies and religions as well? And
but it's okay to just trash Crusaders and Christians.
Yeah, I mean,
anybody can do that from any culture.
I was thinking that
it's okay.
Who has respect for the Crusaders?
Okay.
Come on, it's like the barbarian hordes basically invading.
Yeah, Zamil, how'd you approach that in terms of like respect versus craft and narrative necessity in terms of like an enjoyable, well-paced kind of story?
It's interesting that you guys make that point about the Crusaders, because half of Gunmetal Gods is told from the point of view of a Crusader.
Yeah.
And he is very much
Michael
humanized by the end. Yes, Michael. Yeah. People tell me he's the best character in the book. And he does some absolutely horrible stuff. But the whole point of his character is sort of to show that, these Crusaders who came to the Middle East and, they went on a conquering spree. What they were doing was really bad. But at the end of the day, their motivations were human motivations. And, if we really want to understand the darkness within humanity, we have to understand how people come to be that way. And I guess a modern day analogy you could make would be like Osama bin Laden or something. Like, how do people actually develop that mindset where they dehumanize the other side to such an extent where they'll justify any atrocity? So Micah the Metal, being a Crusader, he sort of embodies that, and my whole goal was to show how a very human person with very human flaws and characteristics can become like that through a process. So that's sort of how his whole character arc goes. When dealing with actual religious analogs, I absolutely avoid using any name or any direct reference to anything that's actually in a, let's say, popular religion or major religion, just because it sort of puts me in a jeopardy where someone will call me out and say, oh, you offended. I've actually been called pro-jihad by someone who read the book. They said, oh, you're pro-jihad the way you wrote the book. Wow. So people will say things to you if you and I want to prevent that as much as possible. So One pantheon in the book is based on the biblical angels. So when you read the Bible, you read the descriptions of these angels, you read what they did. It's very interesting. It's also very scary. So one pantheon is based on them, but I don't use the names, and I obscure it with a lot of Lovecraftian characteristics. So like none of these angels have like tentacles and stuff. So when you add that in there, no one's going to really recognize what I'm referencing. So I because I'm dealing with something which is a little bit touchy, I try to obscure it. The other pantheon is based on the Islamic Arabian gods. So that's sort of a mythology which 99% of people don't know about, but it's a very interesting mythology. So I based the other pantheon on that. And like I mentioned, none of the gods in the story are good. They're all sort of manipulating humanity and using humanity for their own ends. So, I'm not definitely, to be respectful, I didn't want to insinuate that any gods that people are actually worshiping have these characteristics. And the whole Lovecraftian influence, and Cthulhu is on the cover of the book. So no one is thinking, oh, this is a biblical angel, when actually the actual God that's being presented, his characteristics are sort of based on a certain biblical angel. But I'm not going to say this publicly. But anyway,
you just did.
Even though I actually just did. But,
I mean, Cthulhu is your fig leaf, like Cthulhu-shaped fig leaf, isn't it? Like,
right. There you go. I also have some based on Gnostic gods as well. So in the Gnostic Gospels, you have some really crazy like gods that are they're also called angels, but they're not in the canonical Gospels. So I felt more. I actually lifted the names out of that directly because I felt more comfortable using that.
And they're great names too.
Yeah, Saklas and Barbalo and some of these guys were on like something crazy when they came up with that.
The Gnostic stuff, what strikes me the most is it's really kind of very different from just about anything else.
Yeah.
It's much more, Tolkien, right? Where you have the creator god and the other gods underneath, and they all kind of are weird and live in this ethereal, but every once in a while they can come down and take form of battle, and it's really
the Valar,
very different from a lot of other mythologies, which is cool.
Yeah, and Zamil, you mentioned just like the craziness of biblical angels and the way that they're presented in the Bible, which is kind of like this weird dichotomy with the sort of muted representation of angels in popular culture, where it's like going into the Bible, they do weird shit, and they are described in very surreal ways, and I think I'm curious, I want to kind of take a little bit of a detour to just ask all of you, what's in all of your journeys with mythology, if you remember something that is easily like the weirdest shit you've ever encountered in mythology, just like a creature or a god or even a story or something like that. Chelsea, do you want to go for it?
Let me think on this one.
Okay. If anyone has one, go for it. Gabriela. Go. Of course, in the Polish, Polish tradition, there's some weird stuff.
Be a bit weird, of course. But in the kind of different bestiaries I read, so like folkloric creatures from Sci-Fi, I count at least 3 different creatures that basically suffocate people with their breasts as an attack method. It's just
weird.
There you go. I mean, I'm bringing down the tone, but whatever.
That's so strange. 3 different creatures that all suffocate.
I mean, it's just one. It's just not enough. I mean,
gotta have 3. Everything good comes in 3s.
I kind of wonder if Monty Python was inspired.
Dyrk, do you have anything?
Oh, I mean, there's weird stuff, really weird stuff from all of them. Chinese and Japanese have some really bizarre stuff like hopping vampires, and it's like, how scary is a hopping vampire? Really, the hops.
Yeah.
But
You're
I have to
laughing
go.
when they get you.
Yeah, I
Or
have
like
to
a
go.
one-legged like umbrella creature.
Yeah, the one that has the most bizarre and creepy, like really nightmarish, I would say Thailand has some really bizarre ghost and creepy creatures. And it usually has to do with like, of course, they become these things. Usually it's a lot of times it's like women who did something that young women are not supposed to do. So they become this like floating head with its nothing but its intestines glistening, hanging down like tentacles under it as it's floating around and can attack you. And I mean, it's like, what the fuck?
Yeah.
You know, it's just there are a bunch of them from
actually,
that area
Dyrk,
that have really weird stuff.
yeah, I mean, speaking of intestines, I love it's this very goofy creature, but in Japan, the kappa, who, you know, is a river creature who has like sort of like a mix of like turtle and goblin kind of aesthetic.
And the beak,
But
doesn't it have a beak as
yeah,
well?
yeah, like a little like
Yeah.
it's like a turtle sort of beak type thing, but it's like, you know, it if people are swimming in its river, it will like swim up underneath you and just like pull your intestines out of your asshole. It's like
Yeah.
really horrible shit like that.
Yeah.
You know, it's like what went through people's heads to think like, son, don't go swimming in that river or Kappa will tear out your intestines through your butt. Be
Yeah.
careful. It's like what yeah. Zamil or Chelsea, do you have any weird things that you can think of?
The Manananggal from Filipino folklore. It's like a vampire creature, but it only has an upper body. So it doesn't have a lower body. And it has these big bat-like wings and this, like, it's pretty frightening. It's, yeah, that's what came to mind, especially after you mentioned the vampire.
Is it like open at the bottom of the body, like the intestines hang out and stuff? Oh, okay.
All the organs
Like-
are just hanging down
Pretty
there.
much, yeah. It's sort of like that, yeah.
Is there a thing
That-
about Southeast Asia and just like flying creatures with their organs hanging out?
Might be.
Chelsea, did you think of anything?
I don't know if it's as weird as everything you guys have been talking
The
about.
bar is high.
Yeah. No, but one creature I think that I was always kind of fascinated by is called the Himarat al-Qaila, which is, you know, loosely translates into like noon donkey, afternoon donkey. And it's this woman / donkey creature, which, you know, it's a cautionary tale, but it's a cautionary tale that's told to kids in the afternoon because, you know, you don't want them to go outside when it's super hot out. So people would always say like, don't wander outside during this time. Otherwise you'll get captured by this woman donkey creature, which, like I said, has been depicted in various different ways, sometimes with like, you know, the body of a woman and then like a donkey head. And then I've seen some depictions that have, you know, she's almost like a full woman, but then has, you know, the feet of a donkey. But either way, I think it's fascinating.
Why?
That's so strange.
What always scared
exactly.
me,
That's what I thought.
What always scared me were like they would tell stories about how to spot jinn, and they would say that the feet are backwards. So you gotta be staring at people's feet, especially at sunset and sunrise. You gotta be staring at people's feet and make sure they're not backwards, because then you're in some trouble.
I mean, it
So
sounds pretty
stories.
conspicuous, isn't it?
Yeah, it's like get your feet together, people. Jin, figure it out. Oh my god, Chelsea, I'm just like I can't get through my head like why a donkey is the thing that would scare kids away from going out at that.
It's not very scary, is it?
It's the mixture. It's the mixture of both.
Yeah. Yep.
The stubborn donkey woman. Don't go outside. Looking at the future of fantasy, Chelsea, I'll let you go first. What are some things that you would like to see more of from writers who are using gods and mythology in their work?
I mean, I think for me, it's been nice to see diversity that is the diversity of, you know, belief and stuff that is coming from a more personal place. And that's just, you know, something I like to see as a reader, people who are telling stories based on, you know, the culture that they grew up on, and based on, you know, mythologies that they are familiar with in some way, which have, you know, maybe had an impact on them, or which are still seen in some way in their current culture. You know, I think we were talking about this earlier, how even when mythology is, you know, a belief that, you know, based on beliefs that people don't necessarily have anymore, sometimes you still see echoes of those beliefs within our culture, you know, whether it's in festivals or, you know, celebrations and things like that, but sometimes things that are, you know, in our culture still. So I feel like I'm starting to see more of that on the market, which is really cool. You know, more of these stories that are coming from writers who maybe did not have the opportunity to share those stories before, who maybe felt like, you know, who maybe weren't getting picked up as much, who are now getting that opportunity now.
I agree. And Gabriela, what about you?
So I think, you know, I like seeing what, you know, Chelsea mentioned, like there's more sort of variety of different types of stories that are being told. I think the one for me, I think, is that I've seen in some sort of recent works, is that I think people generally should spend less time on social media and just be braver, I think, and less obsessed with, like, you know, something that Zamil was saying was kind of hitting me, is that so many writers are so scared now of the worst faith interpretation of the work possible, which is, and I think as long as you know, you just have to, if you want to create something that is sort of worthwhile, you can't be too preoccupied with you know, the sort of bad faith players out there, because there's so many of them, and everything, the loveliest story on earth will be terribly interpreted by somebody. So you just have to tell the stories that you want and just be inspired by anything you want to be. And I have I've said it before on social media, and once again, as a kind of, you know, I can't speak for all Polish people, which is sort of the point of what I'm about to say, but I have zero problem with people being inspired by Slavic folklore. Like, I don't have an issue, like, the whole sort of, I think people took the term cultural appropriation and misinterpreted it, like completely removing all nuance. And it's taken to such a ridiculous extreme. And I'm like, I personally feel very happy when people are inspired by Slavic culture, if they want to sort of explore Polish history or, you know, Polish traditions. That makes me feel proud, and that makes me feel happy. And I want to see more of that. And I want to see people reaching out and trying to educate themselves, and, you know, like, just be interested in things outside and not be afraid that someone might interpret things wrongly. Because I think a lot of I've seen it more and more in very recent stuff, is that, like, people really sanitize their work, and I'm not about that.
Polish folklore is not about sanitizing.
Nah,
anything.
It's not about that.
Yeah, but Gabriela, I like that. It's you know, it's as we've been saying throughout this whole panel, is to approach these mythologies with respect, but because we are writers, to not stifle your creativity by being as safe as possible. It's like the best stories challenge you as a writer, and then eventually when they get into a reader's hands, they will challenge the reader,
so, I mean,
too.
as
And
long
that's
as
the
you
kind of thing that will,
humanize, it's like we've been all saying this, but basically, as long as you know, you make the characters human, then I don't think you can go wrong, really. It's like, you know, as long as you really see them as human. And I think people need to know their own limits, obviously. It's like, you know, if I couldn't research something properly, then I'm not gonna, you know, maybe write about it. Just because, but I'm aware of what I can do. So I think when people like don't even start doing something because we're scared of like backlash. It's just kills of creativity, and it just sort of stifles growth.
Mm-hmm. And when you do jump into it, it's like, of course, do your research, but at the same time, if you create characters that people empathize with, that'll generate more interest in the story. It's like, Chelsea, what you were mentioning earlier about, you know, kind of challenging this Arab coded history, and I would put it beyond literature. It goes into so many different facets of our culture, but to challenge it in such a way where it's like, okay, here's all of these different people within an Arab culture, an Arab-like culture, and there's so much nuance in there that you can't be like, oh yeah, this Arab person is a thief, of course. Or it's like, there's no way to generalize because you're crafting a world that is thoughtfully prepared in such a way where you have a variety of characters with a variety of moral, you know, direction, a variety of personality types, a variety of sexualities, or a variety of occupations, if you want to call thieving an occupation and what have you. But I think it's really important. It's like, to anyone listening, to be confident in what you're writing. And if you're going to get into it, have a respect and a passion for that cultural and mythological and storytelling tradition, just so you don't shit on it. But it's like, pay respect to it and be proud of what you're doing, so that you don't, like Gabriela said, stifle your creativity and eventually make fantasy like a less interesting place, you know? And Dyrk, what about you? What's your, you know, hope for something you'd like to see more of in terms of writers using
the kinds of things
mythology?
These three are writing, actually, you know.
Yeah.
I teach film as my day job. I'm a film professor, and instead of showing my students the canons of films they have to see because they are the classics and the most important ones, what I try to do is show them things that will make them more interested in seeing other films made around that time or in that part of the world.
Gateways, essentially.
Yeah, and that's the kind of fantasy I really like to read. And I like to think that by incorporating these, instead of appropriating these cultures, by incorporating all these different things, and giving them, you know, I do some info dumping as to what they've been known all over the world.
You love your exposition, buddy.
I love it. Is I would really, my biggest hope would be like, wow, this character of Chelsea from Africa is really interesting. I want to learn more about where he comes from, right? Or the white buffalo woman from Native American mythology, legend, folklore, whatever. Find out what tribe that really comes out of, and maybe look at more of that kind of thing, instead of just seeing it as either culturally appropriated or treated as a token character, because I really don't want to do that at all, even though, you know, just like Gabriela said, some people are going to see it that way no matter what you do or how you try to do it. So that's the kind of thing that I would hope that I could do more of eventually, and see more of the kinds of things, exactly what these three folks are doing. It's fascinating stuff. I mean, it's much more exciting now. You can't stop yourself
from like learning about other, like, you know, other cultures and all of that just because somebody might say something stupid on Twitter, you know?
Right. And well, I was also going to say, you know, just a little bit of research can help a lot, you know. Like I have called Mokosh, she's taken on the persona of a Russian, but Mokosh is not necessarily a Russian deity. She goes across a lot of Slavic cultures. And it's like, just do a little research. If you talk about a certain character from Mesopotamia or the Levant or the Arabic world, you know, there are so many people that see, they think, okay, everybody from Turkey south to Africa and over to Pakistan is there are some Jews, there are some and everybody else is Arabic, right? And that's not true. That's not the case. And if you're going to talk about these characters from certain places, you can't just say that, right?
Mm-hmm.
There is a laziness that I think happens a lot in Western literature. You don't have to like spend your whole life looking at everything, but don't just grab one little thing you see and just assume where it's coming from, right? So, and it's like if I mention a being from Africa, I try to talk about what origination it has, as opposed to just saying it's an African god, which is just kind of silly. So there are things you can do that are very simple to keep from really, screwing up. And I'd like to see more. I'd like to see more of that. That's the reason I brought that up. People taking a little bit of care, just in the simplest things, right?
Yeah. Just do the job well, right?
Yeah.
But
don't generalize either.
But that's the baseline for anything you write about, isn't it?
Yeah, because if you take that approach, it's like you're probably going to write some crap anyway. So it's like be thoughtful about it. Just be thoughtful about your narratives, people. And Zamil, what about you in terms of hopes for the future of gods and mythology in fantasy?
Yeah, I think I feel like there's a lot of space to combine fantasy ideas with ideas from horror, sort of like what I did with Gunmetal Gods, also with ideas from sci-fi, and to take from other cultures that are non-European. So one point I try to make is that, okay, whenever someone writes a story based on a non-European culture, and I myself did this, it's always set in like medieval times, and it's or ancient times. And it's always hearkening back to the past. Whereas what I personally want to see more of is these non-European stories that, maybe it's a cyberpunk story. Maybe it's set in like maybe it's a space opera. Maybe it's something, like an African space opera. Dune, you could say, is a Middle Eastern space opera. So that's a good example of what I'm talking about. But I want to see more of those kind of stories that really, draw from non-European mythologies and just take them to other places that aren't based in history, that are just really imaginative, and that just kind of, take like some of these mythologies that, we're all steeped in, like take Slavic mythology and set it in a space opera. What would that look like? I'm really curious about these things now.
Striga in space.
Yes. That's something for Gabriela to consider, I guess. I mean, I myself have thought of myself.
You're the one throwing it out there, so that's what we expect now.
You take the lead, Zamil.
Your next.
Well, Lightblade sort of is like it's sort of Zoroastrian mythology, but set in like a cyberpunk setting where people are questioning reality and that kind of thing. So I did try to do that, but I think, I want to see more of it, because I think that's sort of more uncharted territory, and it does take a certain mind to do that in a very incredible way, like Frank Herbert, what he did with Dune. To me, he borrowed a lot from Middle Eastern culture, from the Islamic religion, and he set it in space, basically. And me, when I was a young kid reading Dune, I was just like blown away, like that some author was able to do this and be this imaginative. And I think the funny thing is that a lot of people who read Dune don't see the Muslim influences and the Middle Eastern influences. Because I've talked to people. Yeah, I've talked to people who are like, "What are you talking about?" But I tell them, no, Dune is literally the story of the Prophet Muhammad, but set in space. And literally, you know, he gives the same iconography. And you know, you wouldn't recognize this if you didn't know that story in the first place. So I think that's really interesting. And if when I do see stories like that, I get really excited that, okay, someone is, you know, taking a mythology or taking a historical context or you know, something, you know, like I described, but putting it in a totally different kind of setting that is really imaginative. So yeah.
I like that. I'm totally on board.
Roger Zelazny is one of my favorite
Lord of Light
of all time. Lord of Light and Creatures of Light and Darkness. He plays with those ideas. With Lord of Light, it's Hindu, and with Creatures of Light and Darkness, but there's other stuff mixed in. It's more Egyptian. But then of course he throws in like a Greek god here and you know, all kinds of crazy. And the books are really short. If you haven't read them, highly recommended.
Well, Dyrk, on that note, to close out, I'd like each of you to recommend a book, fiction or nonfiction, that illuminates or incorporates mythology in what is for you an oh so satisfying way. Dyrk, you just mentioned Roger Zelazny. Do you want to give any more? And then also let people know where they can find you on social media.
Sure. Yeah. Creatures of Light and Darkness and Lord of Light by Roger Zelazny are both really, really fun and very short. And you know, there are so many others. All the books that these three have read, I would recommend those, though I haven't read them yet. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram as Undyrk, UNDYRK. I'm on Facebook as just Dyrk Ashton, and I have the book page Paternus Books Media on Facebook. And my website is paternusbooks.com, PATERNSUS. Yeah, I could spell my own book title, books.com.
And you can find Dyrk on Wizards, Warriors, and Words, which I edit. So it's like not to be nepotistic, but go check it out. You know. And Chelsea, what about you? A recommendation and where people can find you on social media.
So everyone has probably gathered I'm very much a folklore person. The one story that comes to mind immediately is Gods of Jade and Shadow by Silvia Moreno Garcia, which I absolutely loved. Do we have it on the shelf?
Such a gorgeous cover.
Oh, it's so good.
Great cover.
Such a gorgeous cover. But I mean, we were just talking about, you know, like playing with genre and stuff. And I think that book does really interesting things with genre. The time period that it's set in is not, you know, not the typical like medieval period. And the influences of mythology or folklore in that story are just, I think they're so naturally woven in, and they feel very modern. So that one was one that came to mind immediately. Kaiki, which just came out by Vaishnavi Patel.
Yeah.
That one is also spectacular, just came out this year. So highly recommend that one. In terms of where to find me, so I'm Chelsea Abdullah on both Twitter and Instagram. So that's CHELSABDULLAH. Currently on hiatus from Twitter because it's a black void.
Yeah, that's a good thing.
But we'll be back there eventually. And website is just Chelsea Abdullah. So that's CHELSEABDULLAH.com.
Awesome. Thank you. And she'll jump back on Twitter to promote this episode, but then she can bounce back. And Gabriela, what about you? A recommendation and social media.
So whenever I'm asked this question, my mind goes blank. I was frantically trying to come up with something. But I'm going to give like one old, one new. Okay. And it's like kind of feminist retellings of old folk tales. So by Marion Zimmer Bradley, Mist of Avalon. That was a very influential title on me. And when I was a young girl. I just loved it. So it's just basically Arthurian retelling from the point of view of the baddie of Morgaine Le Fay. And a very new one by Genevieve Gornichek, The Witch's Heart, is
great book.
Basically Norse myth retelling from the point of view of the mother of monsters, Androgboga. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. So the mother of the Fenrir and Hel and the serpent, of course. So it's so those two are really interesting because they give a voice to the baddie, to the kind of the one who was kept quiet in the myths, the one we don't get to see, and it's sort of a very different perspective. So I like the kind of twisting the perspective to the one that we sort of suppress. Enjoy that.
Cool. And social media?
Yeah, so on Twitter, I'd mostly do announcements. But I'm always, my DMs are generally open, which might be a mistake. So if anybody wants to contact me, you can. But it's at Gabriela Houston, basically. And on my website is gabrielahouston.com. And I'm on Instagram as at GabrielaHouston1. So it's mostly
the one and only.
Yes, I do own at Gabriela Houston, but I lost access to it ages ago. So there's nothing on it. So it doesn't matter.
You've become your own doppelganger.
I mean, I own it all. I own it all. I own at Gabriela Houston, at Gabriela Houston 1.
0 through 1,000.
Yeah, basically. I should have done that, isn't it? So yeah, it's mostly pictures of my cat pose. So, it's not the most riveting content, but
very cute. Yeah.
so Twitter and
cool. Thank you, Gabriela. And Zamil, what about you?
The book I will recommend is Between Two Fires by Christopher Buhlman. Is that how you say his last name?
Yeah.
Buhlman? Yeah.
Buhlman, right? All right. This book is very much a horror novel. It's set in medieval times, and it uses biblical mythology, but it does it in a way which I have not seen before. But it's as horrific as possible. So if you're in the mood to read horror and something really disturbing, I would suggest it. But it's a great book. Like it's really well written. He's a great author, and I'm kind of inspired after reading that to write something similar.
He's doing fantasy now. I got to read an ARC of the Black-Tongued Thief, and it's amazing how he can make fun adventure fantasy turn suddenly into the most horrific.
But that's the.
I'm not surprised.
It's just unbelievable. So yeah, I definitely want to read that.
I highly recommend it.
And Zamil, where can people find you on social media?
So on Twitter, at Zamil Akhtar. I'm pretty active on there. So yeah, you'll see me around. My website is zamilakhtar.com. So if you want to check out my books, you can head over there, or you can just search Gunmetal Gods or Lightblade in Amazon. That's where they're sold. So yeah.
Excellent. And I'll throw out a quick recommendation before we close out. P.J. Lee Clark's A Master of Djinn is fantastic book. He's a great guy, super funny. And the book is it's like Zamil mentioned, it blending Djinn and North African mythology and magic with steampunk and awesome 1920s Cairo settings. So it's like, get more stuff like that on the table, people. Come on. But Dyrk, Chelsea, Zamil, and Gabriela, thank you all so much for helping me lift the veil on the many mysteries of gods and mythologies. And it was a ton of fun and so fascinating to hear all your perspectives and pick your brains a little bit. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A pleasure.
Thanks, everybody.